victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people. Our military at home and around the world is on high alert status, and we have taken the necessary security precautions to continue the functions of your government. We have been in touch with the leaders of Congress and with world leaders to assure them that we will do whatever is necessary to protect America and Americans. I ask the American people to join me in saying a thanks for all the folks who have been fighting hard to rescue our fellow citizens, and to join me in saying a prayer for the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested, but make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
President George W. Bush making a statement in Louisiana at an Air Force base en route from Florida. It's uncertain what his plans are and whether he will be returning to Washington, given obviously the security alert. Now, let's look at what did happen when the second aircraft hit the World Trade Center around 9 o'clock in the morning in New York. Now, this is, we believe, amateur video, which was shortly after another plane had already hit the other tower of the World Trade Center. Two planes into two towers of the World Trade Center. An extraordinary sequence of events around 9 o'clock during the morning commute, when up to 50,000 people were beginning to turn up for work in those enormous buildings, the prestige of New York City. Well, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell was in Peru, in the capital Lima, where he was attending an Organization of American States meeting. He said this before he cut short his trip to return to Washington.
A terrible, terrible tragedy has befallen my nation, but it has befallen all the nations of this region, all the nations of the world, and befallen all those who believe in democracy. Once again, we see terrorism, we see terrorists, people who don't believe in democracy, people who believe that with the destruction of buildings, with the murder of people, they can somehow achieve a political purpose. They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy. They cannot destroy our society. They cannot destroy our belief in the democratic way. You can be sure that America will deal with this tragedy in a way that brings those responsible to justice. You can be sure that as terrible a day as this is for us, we will get through it because we are a strong nation, a nation that believes in itself. You can be sure that the American spirit will prevail over this tragedy.
Secretary of State Colin Powell in Lima, Peru, before he left for the United States. Now, for any of you who are just joining us and haven't heard the news, there has been an extraordinary, catastrophic sequence of horrific events involving 4 aircraft over New York City and Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C. One of the events took place with 2 aircraft apparently hijacked, both of them civilian aircraft en route or flying from Boston, which were flown directly into the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. There you can see the second fireball in the second tower. On the right is the first tower, already ablaze after the first aircraft had flown into it. Those two aircraft set fire to the building with civilian passengers on board who'd boarded for a normal, regular, routine internal flight. Within 2 hours, both towers had collapsed. Well, let me make clear which airlines we're talking about. American Airlines says it has lost 2 planes with a total of 164 people aboard. According to news reports, the services were Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles and Flight 77 from Dulles to Los Angeles. 2 United Airlines jetliners have also crashed. In Pennsylvania, United Airlines Flight 93, a Boeing 757 en route from Newark in New Jersey to San Francisco. That crashed about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. The fate of those aboard was not immediately known. It was not clear if the crash there was related to the disasters elsewhere. The second plane was United 175, which was a Boeing 767. That left Boston at 7:58 a.m., bound for Los Angeles. The airline would not say where that plane had crashed. Well, amid the chaos, the FBI and its international partners are already trying to work out who could be capable of planning attacks on this scale and why. Very few groups are thought to have the capability needed, but the Saudi rebel Osama bin Laden is one. He's currently in Afghanistan, where the ruling Taliban claimed today he was not capable of an attack of this size. But according to Islamic Jihad, the attacks were a consequence of United States policy in the Middle East. Here's our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins now on the search for those who were guilty.
In the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, they're celebrating the massacre and mayhem in the United States. What's a disaster to much of the world is seen as a triumph by some. It's evidence of how much hatred has already been refueled by this disaster. Now American intelligence, which missed stopping the attacks, will desperately be searching for the culprits. And to find who's behind it, they'll first ask, how was it done?
I think it's almost impossible to believe that a hijacker could convince an American domestic airline pilot to commit suicide by flying into the World Trade Center. I have absolutely no doubt at all they had trained pilots. We know in the past that they've had pilots who have been perfectly capable of flying aircraft, and this can only be the only, I think, answer to this. American pilots would not do this, but Arab fundamentalists may well be prepared to.
Number one suspect has got to be this man, Osama bin Laden, the richest and possibly the most ruthless terrorist in the world. Bin Laden has declared the destruction of the United States his top priority. He heads and pays for an extraordinary international network of Islamic militants. Whatever the response, Osama bin Laden is already accused by the United States of bombing 2 of its embassies in Africa in 1998. 224 people were killed, including 12 Americans. It's only 3 months now since 4 Islamic extremists were convicted of those bombings by a court sitting in New York. Osama bin Laden was named by American federal prosecutors as the mastermind of these killings and a string of other attacks. Bin Laden is also suspected of involvement in this previous attack on today's major target, the World Trade Center. This bombing in 1993 killed 6 people and blew a 60-foot hole through 4 basement levels of the building. And this evening, many Palestinian and other Islamic militant organizations are distancing themselves from today's attacks. Perhaps they're fearful of American retaliation. A leading Middle East analyst in Britain hopes the blame won't fall on the entire Arab world.
It will stigmatize many innocent people, law-abiding people who have settled in the West. But what can states do? You've got to be practical.
Before today, the worst terrorist attack inside the United States was the Oklahoma bombing of 1995. And it was an American, Timothy McVeigh, who was convicted and executed for that mass killing. But tonight, nobody seriously believes Americans have been killing their own. And the mastermind for these latest attacks is being sought outside America's borders. James Robbins, BBC News.
Well, let me now give you a summary of some of the other news which is coming in at this hour about relating to what's happened in the east of the United States. The New York State National Guard has now been called in to reinforce New York City police after the collapse of the World Trade Center towers because of the security and disorder problems, but also the humanitarian and the health issue, and just to create some kind of order in the south of Manhattan. The New York stock and commodity exchanges are in complete turmoil. Many of those working in Wall Street actually work in the World Trade Towers building. Up to 50,000 people working for a myriad number of corporations work in those buildings. But several leading stockbrokers and big financial institutions do have enormous offices there. And the first plane hit the tower at about 10 to 9, which is when many people would be arriving for work, although many would have been there in the first place. Often many of them get in at 5 or 6 in the morning, simply coping with the European markets and the responses there. But it wasn't just in the World Trade Towers, it was also in Wall Street itself. Many of the brokerage houses and the financial institutions in the smaller, still enormous buildings around the bottom of the World Trade Center. Well, let's now go live to Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, who's speaking live in Downing Street.
We've offered President Bush and the American people our solidarity, our profound sympathy, and our prayers. But it is plain that citizens of many countries around the world, including Britain, will have been caught up in this terror. I have just chaired an emergency meeting of the British Government Civil Contingencies Committee, and I would like to explain some of the measures that we have agreed to take here. There are a range of precautionary measures. We have stepped up security at airports to the highest levels. No flights will take off from the United Kingdom for which we cannot apply the highest standards of security for aircrew and passengers. Private flights have been stopped except where specifically authorised. Flight paths into London have been changed so there will be no civil overflights of central London. Security has been increased across the full range of government buildings and military premises. The police across the whole of the UK are on full alert. All our defence facilities around the world have been moved to high alert to ensure the protection of British service personnel. Advice has been given to major financial and business institutions about appropriate security measures. A number of other security measures have been taken, and of course we are in close touch with US, European and other allies, and are cooperating with them on issues of security. All relevant ministers remain in communication, and the committee, the Civil Contingencies Committee, will meet again tomorrow at 8 a.m. Obviously, some of these measures, not least the effect upon airports, will lead to some disruption, and I hope people understand that. But other than the specific measures we have taken, or that we have advised others to take, business and everyday life can continue as normal. As for those that carried out these attacks, there are no adequate words of condemnation. Their barbarism will stand as their shame for all eternity. As I said earlier, this mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it. This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy, and we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
Tony Blair there, the British Prime Minister, inside number 10 Downing Street, very sombre, confirming there that he, the Prime Minister, had chaired a meeting at the highest level, presumably with the